welcome to Religion Off the Beaten Track with Robin Douglas, a podcast on the lesser-known aspects of religion and belief.
Hello, and welcome to the latest episode of Religion Off the Beaten Track. Today we're joined by Dr. Joel Bordeaux. Joel's a research fellow at the International Institute for Asian Studies. His interests include the interaction of indigenous Indian religion with Western religious movements. Joel, welcome and thanks for being with us today.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
This is a very interesting topic and an absolutely huge topic. I guess if we're looking for a place to start, the story essentially begins in the imperial age, doesn't it?
For my purposes, sure, yeah.
And essentially it's with the British Empire that you first get the encounter of Westerners and traditional South Asian indigenous religions.
That's certainly how I got into it, was looking at the early Orientalist scholarship in English, which was conducted under the auspices of the Company Raj in that time period anyway, and realizing that how many of them were Freemasons or Theosophists or involved in some form of Western esotericism, if we can use that term.
Yeah, and I guess that this would go at least back to Sir William Jones, is that right, in the 18th century?
Yeah, he's usually thought of as the ancestor, the patriarch of Indology, certainly. It was William Jones who first figured out that there's a relationship between Sanskrit and Latin and Greek and most languages spoken in Europe. But yeah, I'm not aware of William Jones having any particular unusual religious entanglements. But certainly the field of Indology broadly construed, usually we can trace to him.
I think as a young man, Jones had what today we'd call pagan inclinations. He was involved in Druid revival in Wales and so forth.
Wow, okay. I didn't know that was going on so early, actually.
I think he was one of the pioneers, actually, one of the first Druid revivalists.
Oh, amazing.
But yeah, there's evidently a long history of this crossover between esoteric pagan religion among Westerners and an engagement with Eastern religion and Indian religions specifically. I guess that we tend to think of the high noon of this being in the Victorian period, where you get Madame Blavatsky and Theosophy and the Golden Dawn and so forth. Would it be fair to say that that's when you get the greatest level of this Eastern-Western engagement?
It's certainly what kickstarts the modern iterations of these things. And for my purpose, yeah, it is exactly that circle coming out of the Golden Dawn and Crowley. That's the track that I tend to follow the most. There are people doing fascinating work on the theosophical side of it as well, but I feel like that's a little better explored at this point.
Yeah, and the Golden Dawn and Crowley also point to another feature of esoteric religious thought in this period in the West, which is that the other great source of inspiration alongside that of India would have been Egypt. And of course, Egypt too would have been part of European colonialism, in that case bound up with Napoleon and Napoleon's invasion of Egypt and so forth. And in both cases, you have these new exoticized areas opening up, and that the potential there for Western people to mine these for data to incorporate into their theories back home.
Yeah, especially if, as in both cases, people felt at liberty to incorporate things from, ages gone by, and so they could sort of more or less write off the present, because if what you're interested in about Egypt is pharaonic Egypt and not, contemporary Egypt so much. And they made similar sort of rhetorical moves with regard to India, that they would say, well, the Indian traditions as they are now have sort of fallen from a great height, and basically now it's a bunch of, they came, within just a hair's breadth of saying a bunch of popery in many cases. But so what's now is a bunch of sort of degraded superstition, but in a previous golden age, those are the traditions that we're going to draw on. Instead of this new stuff that might, God forbid, make us in any way accountable to the people who are the present custodians of these traditions.
Indeed, and this is bound up, isn't it, with the tradition of the gentleman's classical education, where the source of authority is safely in the past.
Indeed, yeah. classical texts, if you can get them, reconstructions from material culture, if not, and then make up whatever you need to fill in the gaps, of course. And it's certainly a great deal of creativity that goes into this process.
My impression is that interest in Indian religious traditions becomes more or less mainstream from about the 1860s onwards. This is the period after the rebellion in India. Would it be fair to say that that's the point when these traditions start attracting a large measure of attention in Victorian society?
I'm not sure how we would measure that necessarily. By the middle of the 19th century, it seems to have become, a reasonable sort of a pop culture or a mass culture phenomenon. There's interest in the 1830s, at least, at which point the Raj, at least in Kolkata, is trying to implement a number of social reforms. And so you had figures like Ram Mohan Roy, who became very well known, and the founding of the kind of Brahmo Samaj, which was tied in with the Unitarian tradition. So, I mean, he was traveling internationally and had a number of these kinds of these connections and a certain amount of the fame that goes along with them. A couple of decades prior to that, the extent to which the average person was aware of this, I think, is maybe a little harder to say. But I do think it got some press, at least. And the Church Missionary Society was pushing a lot of this as well, although with a strong derogatory slant to it, right? As a part of their case for why more missionaries should be allowed into India. So they sent back a lot of information, not all of it credible, but information nonetheless, in their bulletins to the folks back home to raise money or to try to agitate on political fronts for this. I mean, and I assume they wouldn't have done this if it were not successful to some degree. They must have got something out of it, or they wouldn't have been quite so persistent in representing images of Hindu deities or reports about festivals and things like that, all of which, sort of played up as much as possible to scandalize the readers or the viewers. Yeah, so I think there is at least also a segment of society who's getting information that way.
And it's interesting that you should mention the missionary side of this, because I suppose when most people think of the engagement of the British Empire with Indian religion, it would be seen through the lenses of missionary activity. It would be the orthodox colonial ideology. It would be, we are right and you are wrong, you are in darkness and you must be enlightened with the light of Christianity. But it seems that even when missionaries and missionary societies published information in an attempt to spread that message, that information could then be read by people back in England in a subversive way. People might read missionary tracts not in order to participate in the denigration of Indian religion, but because they're genuinely interested in learning information about it, because they think that there might be something there for them to be taught.
Or it might at least spark a curiosity, or they were part of the conversation around these things. So I think anything at that stage that makes Indian religion a topic of conversation is going to potentially lead people to try to find more information. It's more a suspicion on my part than something that I can say with great certainty. But it certainly was. Having come out of a similar context myself, albeit not in the 19th century, but exposed to a certain amount of missionary propaganda, as it were, in my younger years, I certainly read it with interest, but with skepticism toward the agendas of the people who were writing it. And I don't think that it's unfair to speculate that many people in the 19th century were capable of the same kinds of readings that that teenagers in the 20th century could do.
Indeed, and there's the stories like the story of General Forlong springs to mind, who was a British soldier and also was involved in missionary activity, and it was his missionary activity in India which led him to lose his faith in Christianity, and he ended up as a rationalist.
Yeah, I mean, the other side of this, I think that the other track that maybe is of some relevance, although it comes in a little bit later, it takes some time to set in, but that I do think is pretty clearly drawing on some missionary ideas is the boom in sort of pulp fiction. So a lot of these stories of, the innocent British woman who gets drawn into some kind of a so-called love cult. They're chock full of the missionary tropes about the licentiousness of Indian gurus supposedly, and all of the kind of violence lurking just behind the scenes. And these were clearly produced for a mass audience, with the express purpose of titillating them, not to generate, religious enthusiasm. And you can tell clearly because aside from the way that it's written, the sort of the marketing, the book covers are not the sort of things that the missionary society would want to distribute. Yeah. Also, I suppose in a general sense, there would have been some pushback from Jones and his ilk, the sort of, in the earliest sense, the quote unquote Orientalists, the people who did not think that it was really in the best interests of the Raj to allow a lot of missionaries to infiltrate the population. They thought it would disturb the peace, and that maybe it wasn't particularly a good thing or a necessary thing. And as a sort of social force, I mean, you do have some of these scholarships, a lot of it done by people who were classicists before this time, who really try to press the idea that no, there's a sophisticated philosophy and theology here. There's a mythology and a literature that is comparable to, or in some instances, genealogically related to things that we find in the classical tradition, which were, the sort of the high prestige traditions at the time to link them to. So, I mean, we have to consider this also as a faction that's clearly opposed to, Macaulay's famous line about one shelf of a European library being superior to the whole of the literatures of Asia, or something, however he puts it. There was a scholastic from classicists and linguists and certain others push back against that.
But it would only have been a minority who presumably would have looked to Indian traditions as a source of personal spiritual enlightenment. And presumably we're talking there about the Blavatskys and the Crowleys and the sort of people who've got a bent towards esoteric religion or unorthodox religion.
Yes, I think almost certainly a minority, although it is not always the case that people who are involved in these things are broadcasting it. So, I mean, the most obvious example that springs to mind is John Woodruff, Sir John Woodruff, right? So he's a High Court judge in Calcutta, but he's also involved in a project which produces a number of texts under the name Arthur Avalon. So he's clearly trying to sort of keep some measure of distance between his persona, which has ties to the sort of colonial establishment and the legal system and things like that, and his more esoteric pursuits. And subsequent scholarship has shown that in fact he does take initiation into some Hindu tantric traditions. He's pretty heavily involved in these things. His wife is a very well involved in the Theosophical Society, although Woodruff himself is not, strictly speaking, a member as far as we know. But just to put a pin in the idea that in fact there are probably more people who are involved in these traditions than are openly involved in them. And that's true even to the present, right? It's the people concerned about compromising their scholarly objectivity and the like. So this is also a long-standing way that people engage with these things. But on a public level, certainly it's a small thing in terms of probably numerically. In terms of its cultural impact, I think rather outsized considering the number of people who actively become members, for example, of the Theosophical Society.
Yeah, and this point about people having clandestine sympathies, this is a problem for the historian, and not only on this subject, of course, because, I mean, the evidence that we have is a floor rather than a ceiling, isn't it? It tells us that the minimum of the involvement of people at the time in this sort of thing.
Indeed. Yeah. I mean, the upshot of that is that at least I think we don't have to worry exceptionally much about people who purport to have involvement in these traditions, but do not. in fact have that. I mean, there are some cases of this that spring to mind, or at least that implicitly. So I think of you have William Ward, who's a missionary, and in some of his accounts he describes having encountered what would have essentially been tantric rituals, to which, at least as far as the texts would have us believe, and to a certain extent as far as any contemporary ethnography would confirm, are things that would have been limited to initiates. And so he describes these events. To me, when I read them, I think, well, something is clearly not right here, because he should not be there. And if he is there, then something, perhaps even more interesting is happening. But in the case of someone like Ward, I don't think he's clandestinely participating. But I mention it as an outlier case because I don't think what we have, at least very often, is people who feel like they have anything to gain by lying or dissimulating, to the effect that they are deeply involved in these traditions when they're not. If anything, it's probably more the other way around. As you say, it's the tip of the iceberg, perhaps. The people who are plainly involved are a smallish, or as far as we know, could very well be a small fraction of those who are actually participating in these traditions. And there are ways also, I suppose, in which there's a sheer political explanation for some of this as well. If you look at cases where, it was a little surprising to me when I first noticed this, that you find that the East India Company sponsors large puja rituals for the goddess at certain points early on. This is the late 18th century. If we think of that as an especially, overtly, singularly religious event, then it seems really sort of odd. Well, why would they do that? What would they have to gain by that? Does the East India Company really have such a devotion towards the goddess Durga that they want to do this? I think we have to be careful not to overinterpret what could in this case have also been that they were acting in the capacity of what they understood were the responsibilities of the local elites to promote religious activity, or what we might now just sort of think of as cultural events. And so the line between, in some of these cases, what is indicative of personal engagement with the tradition versus what people understand to be their sort of social responsibilities when they're involved in the governance of certain parts of India is also a tricky one to parse sometimes.
Yeah, I guess it's the same as with any adherence to any religious tradition. There's always the combination of motives. There could be genuine spiritual commitment. There could be intellectual interest. There could be a political dimension to it. There could be a social dimension to it, and this is no exception to that.
Indeed, yeah.
And one interesting aspect of this subject of the engagement of Brits in Victorian times with Indian religious traditions is that, somewhat to my surprise, I found that Islam came into this as well. And not only do you have esotericists interesting themselves in what we would call Hinduism, but they also interest themselves in a number of cases in Islam.
Yeah, it's true. And that is perhaps that is something that's happening contemporaneously, I think, with some traditions that are coming out of Egypt and out of Turkey or other parts of the world at that time. I think there was a long-standing engagement, in fact, between, especially in sort of esoteric spheres, a long-standing engagement between Christian and Muslim traditions, if only on the order of translating texts or, from Arabic into Latin and things like that, or perhaps even in some cases strictly rhetorically speaking. So you have this sort of, Rosicrucian, mythos of, the going to the East, by which in this case, presumably we imagine that means Islamic cultures, and bringing back traditions in this way. My suspicion, which I've alluded to in some places, is that perhaps even the very notion of the sort of the secret chiefs is descended in some ways from Sufi ideas about the sort of hidden righteous elites. We find also this in Judaism as well, in certain traditions. The idea of a small spiritual elite that actually govern the world and see to the benefit of the world is something that I suspect is actually lifted or borrowed in some ways from Sufi traditions, in as much as that becomes a massive feature of Victorian era occultism.
Yeah, there's the eclecticism of Victorian esotericists in this regard, and that points to perhaps something of an ethical question, because on the one hand they're going against the usual colonial narrative. They're seeing India in this case as being somewhere to learn from rather than somewhere to teach to. But this eclecticism suggests that they're not really engaging with indigenous traditions on their own terms. It's more a kind of exoticism, and they're picking and mixing together elements from different traditions in a way that might be regarded as being disrespectful. At the time, were people in India aware of what was going on, and did they object to the use that was being made of their traditions?
It's a good question. I think the Indian case is an interesting one, because I think an eclectic approach to religious life is not something that is foreign at all to the subcontinent, right? I mean, this is part of the problem that the missionaries had in India, is they would sort of show up in some place and say, well, have you heard about Jesus? And people would just sort of go, okay, yeah, sure, great. Stick him on the shrine next to the other gods, So I don't think people objected necessarily to the eclecticism as such, at least not as I'm aware. The criticisms that seem to have landed, at least to the extent that we can tell because of the way that figures like Blavatsky or figures like Crowley responded to them, is the association with things like spiritualism. And that is something that we find that both the Theosophists and to a certain degree the Golden Dawn and its offshoots, they really want to distance themselves from. I don't know that that's a criticism that's really anchored in South Asia, or that it's framed in terms of anything like the kind of rhetoric around appropriation and things like that we would normally use to parse these situations in the present. But it seems to my understanding, that was the critique that people took more seriously and found more threatening, I think, is the notion that what they were involved in was some kind of basically some sort of charlatanism, or that it was not susceptible to conscious control, as mediums might be. In some ways, it's arguably an attempt to distance themselves from the more affectively intense, in many ways feminized traditions that were percolating in that milieu, and to make what they were doing more respectable by that metric. In India, my sense is not that it was really that big of an issue. I mean, if anything, there is this. Mriganka Mukhopadhyay has been doing some work on the Theosophical Society in India, and he does demonstrate that the Theosophical Society in India is significantly Indianized, and so we might infer from that people who were engaged with theosophy in the subcontinent were less enthusiastic about the Egyptian stuff or the Hermetica perhaps, but there are other plausible explanations, which would just be that these were the things they were more they were drawing on traditions that they knew better and which had more local resonance, and to which they had easy access to experts who were involved in these things. It's not far off from, local versions of theosophy are often, with possible exception, harder to pin down what that would mean in the American case. But there are regional theosophies, just as there are regional forms of Christianity or Islam or any other tradition, right? And so in some ways, maybe it's not surprising at all that the Theosophical Society in India is substantially more, quote unquote, more Hindu in its orientation than what you might find elsewhere. It could be strictly down to that, or it could be more of a conscious decision on people's part to shy away from the more eclectic aspects of it. But I think it's hard to know until we get a really close look at more of these people's letters and their lectures and this kind of material, which is still being excavated.
Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, we could dwell on the colonial era for a lot longer, but let's move forward to the 20th century and to independent India and the post-war period. People, I imagine, with some knowledge of popular culture would associate the adoption of Indian traditions in the West with the 1960s, with George Harrison and the Beatles visiting the Maharishi and the American counterculture in that period. Is it fair to say that what was going on in that regard is actually just a continuation of an engagement that's much, much older than that?
Yeah, I think that's very fair. There's a long-standing engagement with these traditions coming from, I think it's more or less continuous. The particular things that people are interested in, shifts in certain ways, that the presentation of it shifts. But, by the time that Swami Vivekananda presents at the World's Fair in Chicago in 1893, there is already there's a mania and you can see it in the sort of press from the time, that people are extremely taken with him. There are a number of attempts to try to get him to stick around and do more lectures. There are also other people on the circuit giving lectures on Vedanta, and lectures on yoga is a very hot sort of issue. Then even we think of it also as like there's a sort of a modern yoga boom, not necessarily anymore so more mass produced and commercialized by the sort of late capitalist way that things get commercialized. But there's a long-standing interest in these traditions, at least among the middle classes and things like that. And so I think a lot of that it's pretty continuous. The what seems to be more, to my mind, the larger thing that comes around with relation to the 60s is there are two things. One is the exile of the Tibetan government and the influx of Tibetan refugees into India. That is a new thing at that point that offers much more extensive access to Tibetan traditions than had been previously the case. Perhaps also the desire to engage in these traditions in a devotional way. In the 60s, what seems more apparent than in previous eras is that you have people engaging with things like ISKCON, the Hare Krishna traditions, for example, or a number of the various these kind of export Hindu traditions, which are in many ways more, quote unquote, traditional. That is to say, oriented more towards devotion to personal deities and to the guru, more inclined towards a kind of affective engagement, as opposed to something either philosophical or more kind of somatic, which I think was more frequently the case in previous eras.
Okay, and one well-known expression of esoteric spirituality in not only the 60s, but in the post-war period, which can be linked with Indian and other Asian religious traditions, is Wicca. And of course, Joel Gardner, the founder of Wicca, spent much of his life as a British colonial official in South Asia. And it's said that there are elements of Asian religious traditions that ended up in Wicca. You have elements of Tantra, perhaps. You have reincarnation. Gardner, I believe, also dabbled in Islam at one point. Can Wicca, do you think, be seen as part of the history of engagement of Westerners with Asian religions?
I think in the present, certainly it must be. the connections between the idea of a divine couple, the kind of the goddess and the horned god, that kind of archetype. I think if you grab any Wiccan off the street and talk to them about this idea, there's a decent chance that they're going to bring up the idea that it's also the Shiva, and part of it is kind of that part of the same template or part of the same set of archetypes. It would, depending on the kind of the jargon that they prefer for this kind of thing. But in the contemporary scene, I think it's absolutely involved in this way. And in fact, I have a chapter that I've begun to do some work on Wicca in India. So there is that feedback loop is very much in effect, and so there are Indian instantiations of Wicca, which are very much adapted to the local milieu. And so, I mean, that is one way of looking at it from the point of view of the present. Historically, too, I would say, and it's a thorny question to what degree Crowley really, how much does he really know about Tantra, and how much does he draw on it, because he's a bit cagey about some of this, and uncharacteristically so, maybe. But I would put Wicca in this line, because I see it very much as a descendant in many ways of the OTO under Crowley, which we know that Gardner was at least briefly affiliated with the OTO, whether it was just kind of a ceremonial, like an honorary membership, or whether his engagement was deeper than that is harder to say. But my somewhat cynical, perhaps, read on the origins of Wicca in many ways is that at least part of what Gardner wanted to do was to make a slightly safer for work, take on Thelema. To sand off some of the harder edges, both politically and also in terms of the arguably like really sort of freewheeling ethical aspects of that. But there has been some work done, and it's not hard to see, or if you know people who are involved in both of these traditions, it's often reasonably people are pretty open to acknowledge it. There's a lot of crossover between just even the ritual texts, and so yeah, I would say that historically, if for no other reason, and we do know that Gardner spent some time in Indonesia and places like that. Certainly, he writes about this as well. But arguably, some of the most quote unquote, Indian inspired aspects of Wicca are things that seem to have their precedence in a Thelemic context.
Yeah, and that's interesting, that the whole relationship between Wicca and Crowley is something that I think has not been fully bottomed out yet.
And of course, it's a bind for people to do for a number of reasons, not least of which is that, generally speaking, to get access to some of these materials requires that people swear secrecy. So then, that's the would-be ethnographer of esotericism is familiar with this problem, right? That then how much can you and how can you sort of describe the material when you essentially have to swear that you won't do that in order to gain access to it in the first place. So if people are being remotely ethical about it anyway, it's a bind. I suppose there's always the option of just doing what Francis King or some of these figures allegedly did, which is go in undercover, so to speak, get as much access as you can, and then publish it all, burn the source. But that's not. I wouldn't recommend that course of practice. As much as I am glad or I'm not going to not read these things just because they were obtained in arguably under dubious ethical conditions. But I don't think it's ideal.
Yeah, indeed. And mention of Crowley suggests something else. I'm struck by the symbolism of what happened with Crowley and his friend, and I think he was his lover as well, Alan Bennett, because you have these two Victorian Englishmen who were both in the Golden Dawn. They both had esoteric interests. They engaged in occult activity together, and they both went in different paths. You had Crowley going into this Western eclectic syncretic path, which incorporated elements of Egyptian, Indian, other religious traditions. And you had Alan Bennett, who actually went to India and settled there and became, I believe, a Buddhist monk and fully immersed himself in that tradition. And it seems to me that these are two diverging paths for people who are interested in Indian religious traditions. You could go down the syncretic pick and mix path, or you could properly immerse yourself in the tradition. Do you think it's fair to say that that's a choice that's probably always existed and still exists today?
Yes and no. What I question is the extent to which the unadulterated, the supposed immersive kind of quote going native version of this is really an option. That is to say, partially because of globalization, partially because of just the way that I tend to think that the human mind works. And I'm not convinced that even, Alan Bennett, who picks up and moves to Sri Lanka and becomes a monk, my suspicion in that case, and in any case like it, is that there's still a great deal of syncretic processing that's going on. That people are still understanding whatever ideas that they're absorbing with reference to the toolbox that they bring to the table. So, if you're Alan Bennett coming at this from the perspective of the Golden Dawn, and you have that training and you have a general sort of background, and I mean he's coming out of a different sort of cultural milieu and linguistically as well. I mean, the people that he's going to be able to interact with and who are going to be able to communicate these ideas to him in a way that he can understand are going to be, by and large, at least for a very long time, are going to be English educated elites to some substantial degree. These are people who are then will have been in conversation with, they're going to run in the same circles with the theosophists in many ways, right? Crowley is going to show up in Sri Lanka and study, some meditation and things, there alongside Bennett, or at least that a teacher that Bennett, refers him to. Yeah. So, I mean, I guess that's the point at which I think that the dichotomy there is a little questionable, because I'm not sure that it's not always syncretic to some degree. There's the approach where you foreground that and make it a feature, I guess, rather than a bug, and that's exemplified by, to my mind, things like what Crowley's supposed translation of the Tao Te Ching, right? Where he's just made stuff up, right? It's this kind of it's like a lot of translations of Rumi in some ways also that are floating around. It's people very impressionistic ideas about these things. And certainly there are people who make more of an effort to get away from that and to try to engage with these things, at least in primary sources, and to try to work within local idioms and acculturate as much as they can. And that's, I think that's, you can make efforts in that direction, but I still strongly suspect that no matter how much of that one does, the past doesn't just go away, right? It's not even past, right, so to speak. So when you go to these events and it's a Hindu or Buddhist event, and you see people sitting there who clearly, to observe them, know the ritual script, right? They are part of the scene, and it's clear that they that people know them. You can kind of tell by the way that they interact with the with the other participants and the environment. But they're still wearing like a t-shirt with like the Kabbalistic tree of life on it, or there are lots of cues to my mind when I've done kind of fieldwork in some of these contexts, that even the people who appear to be deeply immersed are only there's only so much that one can do, and even with the desire to do so, to entirely extricate oneself from one's culture and training and previous ways of thinking. It's a lifetime project, and not everyone really wants to spend their lifetime doing that. Lots of people seem perfectly content to, practice Hinduism or Buddhism and still do like divination with tarot. That is not something I think often that even necessarily the teachers object to. The flip side of that, I guess I should say, is from the point of view of of a lot of the teachers, and from a sort of a long durée way of looking at religious traditions, the idea that there's an authentic core of the tradition is itself also a questionable notion, because what we see in practice is that the people who carry these traditions to different places adapt them, and the people in the places where these traditions are being received also have to do a similar process of translation and adaptation, and that is not unique to the Western engagement with these things, right? The movement of Hindu traditions to Southeast Asia changes substantially what Hinduism looks like there, and the movement of Buddhist traditions into Korea it's a lot different. It looks very much different from what you find in Indian Buddhism, and so in that, from that point of view, it's also not surprising that Western engagement with these things would yield its own distinctive forms, and they are, from a certain point of view, no less authentic. It's just another iteration of a process that we've seen in many different cases, with some questionable, economic and political fingers on the levers of these changes, though, to be clear.
Yes, so I suppose the conclusion is that the whole idea of distinguishing between an authentic version of a religion, a pure indigenous original version, as opposed to a syncretic, eclectic version, is invalid. We're all eclectic in some ways. All traditions are eclectic, and
that's my inclination. I mean, it's not something that often the custodians of these traditions would often disagree with that. But as a sort of historian, or as an ethnographer, whichever hat, for me, that is the tendency that I would take with it.
That seems like a good note on which to end. Joel, thank you for being with us today. That's been very interesting, and there's a lot of food for thought there. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, it's been a lot of fun to have a conversation with you.
You have been listening to Religion Off the Beaten Track with Robin Douglas. Remember to follow us on Twitter and Facebook.